We're now moving away from errors of agreement, like errors with verbs or adjectives or nouns or pronouns, and into errors and issues having to do with sentence structure. So sentence structure is how a sentence is put together overall, right? Not just about the individual words, though those matter, but how the sentence is structured as a whole. And this is one of the more important videos in this series. This is something you definitely have to get because it's important for a lot of the improving sentence questions and even some of the error IDs. So make sure you get the difference here between a clause and a phrase. So let's talk about a clause first. A clause is any group of words that contains a subject and a main verb or a finite verb. Remember, a main verb slash finite verb is a verb that's conjugated, right? So it has tense, it has a number, right? It's either singular or plural. So a clause is any group of words that contains this relationship between a subject and a verb. So let's look at some examples. Well, first we have I walk, right? The most basic sentence, the most basic clause. I walk. I is my subject, and walk is my main verb. The man is watching the birds. So here, the man is our subject. And our main verb is, and in part with is watching. But is really the main verb there, right? It's the thing that's conjugated. It's the thing that has tense. So this would be a complete sentence or a clause. The growling, sinister troll under the bridge near the northern river growled at the brave yet wary travelers on the road. So again, subject would be this whole long phrase right here. Really, the simple subject is the troll, but this whole thing is a bunch of adjectives and prepositional phrases modifying that noun troll. The verb then is growled. It's a main verb, right? It's conjugated. It has tense. And then the rest of the sentence completes. How about the next sentence? Which I described to my brother. So now this isn't a complete independent sentence, and we'll talk about the difference between an independent and a dependent clause in a second, but it's still a clause because notice it has a subject, I, and a verb, described. So it's still a clause, and we'll talk about the difference between an independent and dependent clause in a second, but any group of words that contains a subject and a finite verb can be categorized as a clause. Well, what about a phrase? Well, a phrase, as you might expect, doesn't contain that subject-verb relationship, though it may contain verbals, and I'll talk more about verbals later. But basically, it's any group of words that don't contain this relationship. So, for example, thinking over all his options, right? This is a phrase that contains verb-like things in it, thinking, but notice it's not quite a verb, a main verb because it's not conjugated. It doesn't have tense. This is a participle here. But yeah, so this is a phrase because it has some nouns and it has, things that are in sentences, but it's not a main subject-verb relationship. How about this? The mansion located on the outskirts of town. Again, this is a particular kind of phrase, which is a noun phrase because it contains combinations of nouns, prepositional phrases, adjectives, right? So it's a phrase because it doesn't contain a main verb and it could be part of a sentence, but it's not a clause. To improve your SAT skills. So here we have a verbal, we have an infinitive, to improve, but it's not a main verb because it's not conjugated. Doesn't have number, doesn't have tense. Right? So to improve your SAT skills. So this could be a noun phrase, it could be a lot of different things, could serve as different functions in a sentence, but we know it's a phrase. Okay, so let's leave behind phrases for a bit. We're going to talk more about those later when we talk about dangling modifiers and things like that. But for now, let's look at the difference, the very important difference between an independent clause and a dependent clause. So an independent clause is a clause that can stand by itself. So it can function as a sentence. It doesn't need anything else to complete it. So examples, we've seen a lot already, but some more. John returned from Paris yesterday. Here's our subject. Here's our main verb. So it's a clause. And notice it's a complete sentence. We don't have to add anything to it. We don't have to change it in any way. It's complete. I am running the marathon today. Same thing. Subject, verb, complete sentence, no changes required. What about a dependent or subordinate clause? So this is a clause that can't stand by itself. So it has a subject and a verb in it, but it just can't stand by itself. You need more sentence to make it complete, right? So let's look at some examples. Before he left for Jessica's house. You can almost, kind of the way the sentence feels, it's waiting for something. Before he left for Jessica's house, what? I mean, what happened? What did he do? What happened to him, right? So this is a clause, right? Subject, verb, but it's not a complete sentence. We would have to maybe say add a comma and add some information. So like before he left for Jessica's house, John grabbed his keys, whatever, right? Something like that. It needs to complete. It's a dependent or subordinate clause because it's dependent or subordinate to an independent clause. So we would have to match this with an independent clause right here to complete the sentence. Even though Dexter covered his tracks. So again, subject, verb, so it's a clause, but it's subordinate or dependent because it's waiting for something else to complete the sentence. Because he was late. Okay, again, subject, verb, but still waiting for some other stuff, right? Because he was late, what? Like, what's the connection? What's the rest of the sentence? These, we'll talk about a little bit more later. These are subordinate clauses with subordinating conjunctions. So before, even, because, while, words like that create subordinate clauses, and they thus require you to have some other completing part of the sentence. We'll talk more about those in a second. Who is known for his screenplays? So this we already talked about. It's a relative clause. And now I think it makes sense as to why we call it a relative clause. It starts with a relative pronoun, which is essentially the subject of the clause. And then we have a main verb, right? Who is known for his screenplays? So we need to have more of this, right? So we can say John, who is known for his screenplays, works in Hollywood, right? This is not complete on its own. It needs more. How about this relative clause? That I found yesterday. So again, subject, which in this case would be the that, I, which is the verb, so it's a clause, but it needs more. It's not complete on its own. So for example, the key that I found yesterday opens the treasure chest, whatever it might be, right? So again, it's not complete without more. So this important distinction, first between a clause and a phrase, and then an independent clause and a dependent clause, is really important. So make sure you know this because it's going to affect a lot of the errors and rules that we see later. Okay, let's move on.